Grapple fans, my name is Walton Scott. And I shall be your host as we look at British pro wrestling. The goal of this production is to introduce the professional wrestling that millions of British Grapple fans enjoyed in halls across the country, and on the small screen, throughout the 20th century. Now in the 21st century, on the internet. Now let us take a brief look at the history of professional wrestling in Britain with my colleague Graham Williams.
Like many cultures, wrestling was a common sport for a long time, and was popular in the early 20th century. In the 1930s, all-in wrestling was popularized in Britain just as it had been popular in the United States. Wrestlers of the era such as Bert Asirati and Jack Pye were legitimate amateurs, who added some show. By the end of the 1930s, changes in the sport came because gimmicks and violence had run rampant. Furthermore, World War II curtailed entertainment across Britain. In the post-war years, Admiral Lord Mountevans led an overhaul of the sport. The introduction of weight classes and stricter regulations gave the sport back its legitimacy. These changes allowed the sport to boom over the next few decades. Britain saw joint promotions take over pro wrestling using a similar cartel arrangement between promoters as the NWA in the United States. While independent groups would show up, the joint structure and their tight grip on the sport held through the TV era. In 1955, the first pro wrestling show aired on television. 10 years later, pro wrestling was one of the most popular sports in the country. Television wrestling was talent-driven, and ultimately the talent began breaking away from joint promotions. Max Crabtree began promoting his brother Shirley as Big Daddy in the 1970s. Despite being middle-aged and overweight, the Big Daddy character became a phenomenon as a blue-collar type hero. The balance of charismatic Big Daddy taking on exciting heels on top, and traditional British wrestling underneath was a successful formula for many years. In the 1980s, a series of events led to the death of British wrestling. The talent grew frustrated with the Crabtree's booking, and Big Daddy's unrivaled spot on top. Brian Dixon's All-Star Promotions hired up disgruntled talent and grew steadily. The WWF began airing in Britain, which exposed younger fans to a faster and more colourful product. The media also turned on pro wrestling after an opponent of Big Daddy's died in the ring. World of Sport was cancelled and British wrestling bounced around the television before being cancelled entirely.
Thank you, Graham. Now then, British wrestling still exists, but unfortunately on a very small scale. As mentioned, many changes were made in post-war years by Lord Mountevans. Many people are vaguely familiar with the round system, which is common across Europe and is common in other combat sports. Just as the Queensberry rules became the norm in boxing, Mountevans rules became the norm in pro wrestling.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a catchweight contest. So over 6 5-minute rounds of 2 falls, 2 submissions, or a knockout to decide.
Seconds away, round 4.
And he landed well, Jostrick, very well indeed. But what he's doing now with the folding press, if he can hold those arms, he's got him. And an immediate submission game. Great drop kick by Marty. Top foot landed well. No, he's not. He's just going to make it, or is he? No, he's not. He's not going to make it. He's not going to make it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mick McManus receives public warning number 1.
Equalising fall for the British welterweight champion, Danny Boy Collins.
You never counted 3. You counted 2, referee.
And the referee gives the right corner Jimmy Briggs his second and final public warning.
Well, this is the interval, but the bout continues. And the referee thrown across the ring. In the 10th corner of the screens there, and all the way down with the guillotine on the but it's right on the back. And it's just a question of how well he landed there on Jones. He gets his second public warning for it. Mick McManus, heck of a test for him. Double wrist lock, pass to the...
Next, we shall break down the weight class system, also set up by Lord Mount Evans. Weight classes are not foreign to fans of combat sports. Like in boxing and mixed martial arts, weight classes allow for a greater variety of styles. Lower weight classes include faster and often more athletically dynamic performers, while the upper weight classes include more physically imposing performers with a slower yet hard-hitting style. Professional wrestling has traditionally had two divisions, heavyweight and junior heavyweight. In Mexican lucha libre, weight classes are common. In this next segment, we will compare British, Mexican and Ultimate Fighting weight classes.
Now, let's look at the 7 distinct weight classes established by Lord Mount Evans. It should be mentioned that super heavyweight wrestlers and bouts were billed as such, but there was never a designated championship. Catchweight bouts occur between wrestlers in different weight classes. This term is still used in MMA to this day. While it was very rigid in the early years, weight classification later became based upon appearances, rather than actual weights. This graph gives some points of reference for comparing British wrestling weight classes to those weight classes used in Ultimate Fighting, or MMA, as well as those used in Mexican lucha libre. The smallest weight class, called lightweights, provided some of the quickest and most technically brilliant wrestling. Notable stars of that weight class were the legendary George Kidd, his successor Johnny Saint, Steve Gray and Jim Breaks. Similarly sized MMA fighters such as BJ Penn and Takanori Gomi, while a similarly sized luchador would be the El Hijo del Santo of the 1980s. Welterweights were exciting, and able to bounce between the speedy lightweights and rougher middleweights. Notable stars of that weight class were Vic Faulkner, Jack Dempsey, Alan Kolbick and Jim Breaks. Similarly sized MMA fighters would be George St. Pierre and Matt Hughes, while similarly sized luchadors would be El Hijo del Santo, Fuerza Guerrera and Carlos Lagarde. Middleweights were often rough characters who battered smaller opponents. Mick McManus, one of the true legends of British wrestling, worked as a middleweight, and other heels such as Brian Maxine, Adrian Street and Mal Sanders were successful at that weight as well. Similarly sized MMA fighters would be Anderson Silva and Kazushi Sakuraba, and similarly sized luchadors would be the legendary El Santo and the recent sensation Mystico, who became Sin Cara in the WWE. Heavy middleweights were often a variety of technicians and ruffians. Men like Bert Royal and Alan Kilby were popular blue eyes who faced off with men like Dave Fit Finlay and Mark Rollerball Rocco, who could exchange holds and get nasty at times. The typical heavy middleweight size is uncommon in MMA because it is in between two popular weight classes. However, similarly sized luchadors like Octagon Stars and Lopez and Rene Guajardo are bona fide legends in Mexico. The light heavyweight class in Britain had several dominant figures like Billy Joyce, Mike Marino and Marty Jones that were long and frequent title holders. Comparable MMA fighters would be Dan Henderson and Rich Franklin, and similarly sized luchadors would be Pero Aguayo, Gran Hamada and El Solitario. The mid-heavyweight class featured men who could mix it up with the heavyweights, but have a faster-paced bout with lighter-weight opponents as well. Mike Marino, Fit Finlay and Norman Walsh were masters of this weight class. Similarly sized MMA fighters would be Vanderlei Silva and Quinton Rampage Jackson. And on the Lucha Libre side it would be men like Dr. Wagner Jr., Ray Mendoza, Fishman, and El Satanico. Heavyweights in British wrestling were well-known men like Bert Azerati, Billy Robinson and Pat Roach. In MMA, heavyweights like Randy Couture, Mark Coleman and Fedor Emelianenko have been dominant stars in their primes. And in Lucha Libre, El Halcon, Sin Caras, and Enrique Ibarra found success at that weight class. Although heavyweights are not often the premier stars in Mexico,